Obese girl's garden was destroyed before Harvest Mountain Man's seed changed her life and the valley. The autumn sun of 1824 rose slowly over the Willamette Valley in the Oregon country, casting long shadows across Dorothea Blackwell's garden plot. She had been awake since before dawn, as she had been every day for the past 11 months, working the stubborn earth with nothing but a hand hoe and determination that ran deeper than the Columbia River. At 23 years old, Dorothea carried the weight of her world on broad shoulders and strong arms. Her body, thickened by years of manual labor and the hearty diet of potatoes and cornmeal that sustained her through endless days of toil, moved with surprising grace as she bent to examine the ripening squash. Society might whisper about her figure, but the earth didn't judge. The earth simply demanded work, and Dorothea had work to give. The garden stretched before her like a promise, nearly 2 acres of carefully tended rows. Carrots pushed their orange shoulders through the dark soil. Cabbages formed tight, perfect heads. Turnips swelled beneath the ground. Bean vines climbed their poles toward the sky. Everything was just days away from harvest, representing not just food, but hope. $15, she calculated. Maybe even 17 if the Henderson family bought extra for their boarding house. Enough to see her through the winter, enough to buy seed for next spring, enough to prove she could survive alone. She hadn't always been alone. Her father, a failed merchant from Philadelphia, had dragged their small family west on promises of opportunity, only to succumb to fever within a year of arrival. Her mother followed him 6 months later, leaving Dorothea with nothing but debts, this marginal plot of land on the edge of wilderness, and the knowledge that the world was not kind to women without means or matrimonial prospects. The neighboring Corbett Ranch sprawled across the valley like a sleeping giant, 300 acres of prime farmland worked by a dozen hired hands. Samuel Corbett himself, a thin-lipped man with eyes like winter ice, had offered to take the burden of the land off her hands for a pittance after her parents died. When she refused, his expression had hardened into something uglier than mere disappointment. Dorothea straightened, pressing one hand to the small of her back. The morning mist was burning off, revealing the full glory of her achievement. Every plant represented hours of back-breaking labor, clearing stones, breaking clods, hauling water from the creek in wooden buckets, pulling weeds until her hands bled. She had done it all without a plow, without an ox, without anything but her own muscle and will. "Beautiful morning for it, Miss Blackwell." The voice startled her. Standing at the edge of her property was Silas Corbett, Samuel's eldest son, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Behind him, she could see 2 ranch hands watching from a distance. "Morning?" Dorothea replied carefully, not moving from her position between Silas and her garden. "Pa wanted me to make one more offer, $20 for the land, and we'll even help you move your things to town. There's a boarding house that might take you on for washing." "I've told your father no 3 times. The answer hasn't changed." Silas's smile thinned. His gaze swept across her garden with something that looked like hunger, or perhaps hatred. "Shame to work so hard for so little. Woman alone, it's not natural, not safe. I manage. Do you?" He stepped closer, and Dorothea's hand tightened on her hoe. "Lots of things can go wrong with a garden: blight, pests, accidents." He said the last word slowly, letting it hang in the air like a threat. "Think about Pa's offer, Miss Blackwell. Winter's coming, and it's a hard thing, being cold and hungry and alone. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and walked away, his boots heavy on the packed earth. Dorothea watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She told herself it was just words, just intimidation. The Corbetts wanted her land to expand their holdings, but they wouldn't actually harm her garden, would they? That night she slept poorly, waking at every sound. The wind in the trees became footsteps. The cry of a distant owl became voices. She told herself she was being foolish, but something primitive in her belly whispered warning she couldn't ignore. The scream that tore from Dorothea's throat the next morning scattered every bird within a half-mile radius. Her garden, her beautiful, nearly ready-to-harvest garden, lay in ruins. Deep hoof prints scored the earth like wounds. Every row had been trampled, crushed, ground into the mud. Carrots lay torn and scattered, their orange flesh exposed to the morning sun. Cabbages were pulverized into green paste. Bean poles lay snapped like kindling. The few squash that hadn't been completely destroyed bore the marks of deliberate violence, smashed open, their seeds and flesh spread across devastated earth. Dorothea fell to her knees in the mud, her hands reaching for something, anything that might be salvaged. A whole cabbage, a single intact carrot. But there was nothing. 11 months of work, destroyed in a single night. The evidence was everywhere, the deliberately driven cattle tracks leading from the Corbett ranch, the pattern of destruction too systematic to be accidental. She didn't cry at first. The loss was too immense for tears. She simply knelt there in the ruins of her dreams, her dress soaking up the muddy water, her hands hanging limp at her sides. Without this harvest, she had nothing. No money for winter supplies, no seed for spring planting, no hope of holding on to her land. The Corbetts had won. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down her face as her body shook with sobs. She cried for her dead parents, for her lost year of labor, for the future that had just been trampled into the mud along with her vegetables. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, and she had no tears left to shed. "Miss?" The voice was gentle, touched with an accent she couldn't quite place. Dorothea looked up through blurred vision to see a man standing at the edge of her ruined garden. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin that had seen many seasons, with hair that fell past his shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. A long rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm, and his dark eyes surveyed the destruction with an expression that suggested both understanding and anger. "I'm sorry to intrude on your grief," he said quietly, "but I know deliberate cruelty when I see it." Dorothea tried to speak, but her voice came out as a croak. She swallowed hard and tried again. "It doesn't matter. It's done." "May I?" The man gestured toward her garden. At her nod, he stepped carefully between the rows, examining the damage with the focus of someone reading a story written in the earth. He crouched beside the deepest hoof prints, touched the destroyed plants, studied the pattern of devastation. "Cattle," he said finally, "driven hard, 3, maybe 4 head. See how the tracks overlap here? They were herded back and forth deliberately." He stood, brushing mud from his hands, and turned to face her. "This wasn't wandering livestock. This was intentional." "I know." The words came out flat, defeated. "The Corbetts. They've wanted my land since my father died." The man's jaw tightened. "Hosea McAllister," he said, extending a hand. "Trapper, mostly. Some hunting. I trade with the Nez Perce up north, winter in these parts. Dorothea Blackwell. Her hand disappeared in his larger one. Though I don't suppose I'll be here much longer, without this harvest. How long until you need to leave? I have provisions for maybe 2 weeks. After that. She shrugged helplessly. I'll have to take whatever the Corbetts offer, which won't be much. Hosea was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he looked at her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. What if, he said slowly, there was a way to salvage this? There's nothing to salvage. It's all destroyed. Not the garden, the season. He knelt again, this time scooping up a handful of soil and letting it run through his fingers. Good earth, still warm, not too wet, not too dry. Tell me, Miss Blackwell, have you ever heard of the Hubbard squash? Dorothea followed Hosea to his camp, a neat arrangement of canvas and supplies tucked into a grove of pines 1/2 mile from her property. He moved through the wilderness like he was part of it, reading the land the way she read her mother's old Bible. The Nez Perce taught me many things, he said as he rummaged through a leather pack. How to read weather in the clouds, how to track a deer through snow, and how to grow food in conditions that would make a Philadelphia farmer weep. He pulled out a small canvas bag, tied at the top with leather cord, including how to save a season everyone else would call lost. He opened the bag and poured a handful of seeds into Dorothea's palm. They were large and flat, cream-colored with subtle variations in their patterns. Hubbard squash, Hosea explained, but not the variety, you know. This strain was developed by the Nez Perce over generations. They shared it with me after well, that's another story. The point is, these seeds have been selected for rapid growth. Where normal squash takes 90 days from planting to harvest, these mature in 45, maybe 50 in cooler weather. Dorothea stared at the seeds, afraid to hope. That would put harvest in early November, before the hard frost, before winter truly sets in. Hosea's eyes held hers. I'm not saying it will be easy. We'll need to work the soil again, clear the debris, plant immediately. The weather will have to cooperate. But it's possible. Why? The question burst from her before she could stop it. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Hosea was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. 5 years ago, my wife and infant daughter died of fever. We had a small farm in Kentucky. After they passed, I couldn't stay. The land, the house, everything reminded me of what I'd lost. I walked away from it all, came west, became someone else. He looked at her garden, still visible through the trees. I've seen enough people lose what they love. If I can help you keep what's yours, maybe it balances the scales a little. Tears pricked Dorothea's eyes again, but these were different. Not tears of despair, but of something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. I don't have money to pay you, she said honestly. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for a chance to do something good. He poured more seeds into a second bag. Besides, I've got a winter to kill. Might as well spend it teaching someone who actually wants to learn. They shook hands on it, and Dorothea felt something shift in her chest, the first loosening of the terrible tightness that had gripped her since dawn. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of desperate, focused labor. Hosea proved to be not just a trapper, but a farmer of surprising skill, his knowledge of soil and seasons honed by years of observation and learning from native peoples. They began by clearing the destroyed plants, a heartbreaking task that required pulling up every trampled vegetable and tossing it onto a compost heap. Hosea insisted on saving even the ruined material. "Nothing is wasted," he explained as they worked. "These plants will rot down over winter and feed next year's garden. The earth remembers everything we give it." Once cleared, they prepared the soil. Without a plow, this meant hours of work with hoe and spade, breaking up compacted earth, mixing in composted material from Dorothea's heap. Hosea taught her techniques he'd learned from the Nez Perce, how to read soil texture by feel, how to create small hills that would warm faster in the sun and drain better after rain. "The secret isn't just the seeds," he explained one afternoon, his hands dark with rich earth. "It's creating the right conditions. These squash need warmth, good drainage, and consistent moisture. Give them that, and they'll race toward maturity like they're running from winter itself." They planted in a pattern Hosea called the Three Sisters Squash in Hills, with quick-growing beans and corn planted alongside. "The corn gives the beans something to climb," he explained. "The beans fix nitrogen in the soil. The squash leaves shade the ground, keeping moisture in and weeds down. They help each other." Dorothea had never considered that plants might cooperate, might form partnerships as complex as human relationships. As she worked alongside Hosea, planting seed after seed with careful attention to depth and spacing, she felt her understanding of the earth deepening. But it wasn't just farming knowledge he shared. As they worked from dawn until dusk, Hosea told stories of his travels through the Rocky Mountains, of winter camps where the snow piled higher than a man's head, of trading with indigenous tribes and learning their languages. He spoke of grizzly bears and wolves, of rivers that stretched wider than towns, of landscapes so vast they made a person feel both infinitely small and profoundly connected to something larger. Dorothea, in turn, found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, about her father's pride and poor business decisions, about her mother's quiet strength in the face of loss, about the loneliness of being different, of carrying weight the world judged as weakness rather than recognizing the strength required to bear it. "You know what I see when I look at you," Hosea said one evening as they watered the newly planted hills by moonlight. "I see someone who refuses to break. The Corbetts tried to destroy you, and here you are planting seeds in the dark because you will not give up. That's not weakness, Dorothea. That's pure strength." Something warm unfurled in her chest at his words, at the way he said her name like it was something precious. The seeds germinated within a week, pushing up through the soil with determined enthusiasm. Within 2 weeks, the hills were covered with broad, healthy leaves. The weather cooperated with unnaturally perfect timing, warm days, cool nights, enough rain to keep the soil moist, but not waterlogged. "It's like they know," Dorothea whispered one morning, marveling at the rapid growth. "Like they understand we need them." "Plants always know what they need," Hosea replied. "We just have to listen." But as the garden flourished, trouble brewed from the direction of the Corbett Ranch. Dorothea began to notice increased activity along their shared property line, ranch hands riding past multiple times a day, always slowing to stare at her replanted garden. Silas Corbett himself appeared one afternoon, his face dark with something that looked like fury. "Thought you'd be gone by now," he called across the fence. "Thought wrong," Dorothea called back, her voice stronger than she'd expected. His eyes narrowed. "What are you growing there?" "Hope," she said simply, and turned her back on him. That night, Hosea suggested he move his camp closer to her property. "Just as a precaution," he said carefully. "Men who would drive cattle through a garden once might try something worse." Dorothea wanted to refuse, to insist she could handle it herself, but she also wasn't stupid. "There's an old shed behind the house," she said. "It's not much, but it's better than a tent when the rain comes." They both knew he was staying for more than security. They both knew something was growing between them faster than any squash could manage, but neither spoke of it yet, afraid that naming it might somehow jinx the fragile hope sprouting in both their hearts. The squash grew with almost miraculous speed. By mid-October, the vines had spread across the hills in thick carpets of green, and the fruit had begun to form first as tiny bulges, then as fist-sized orbs, then as massive, heavy squash that required both hands to lift. Hosea checked them daily, teaching Dorothea to read ripeness in the deepening of color, the hardening of the rind, the drying of the stem. "Another week," he would say, "maybe 10 days." But the Corbetts were watching too. Their harvest had come in poorly. Their squash, planted in spring according to traditional timing, had struggled in the unusually cool summer. While Dorothea's late-season planting benefited from early autumn warmth, the Corbett crops had languished. Their market vegetables, once the valley's standard, looked sickly compared to the vigorous growth visible from the road on Dorothea's property. Samuel Corbett himself appeared one gray morning, his mouth a thin line of displeasure. Hosea stood at Dorothea's side as the rancher surveyed the garden with barely concealed rage. "Interesting situation you've created here, Miss Blackwell," Corbett said coldly. "Some might wonder where a failed farmer's daughter found such miraculous seeds. Some might even suggest theft." "Then some would be liars," Hosea said quietly, his hand resting casually on the knife at his belt. "These seeds are Nez Perce cultivars, given freely as a gift. You want to question that? You can take it up with Chief Twisted Hair himself when he comes through to trade. I'm sure he'd be interested to hear about cattle being driven through a young woman's garden." Corbett's face purpled, but he was trapped and he knew it. Accusing Hosea of theft would mean admitting his own crimes. "This isn't over," he said finally, and stalked away. That night, Hosea insisted on keeping watch. Dorothea tried to argue, but he was immovable. "They've lost face," he explained. "Your success highlights their failure. Men like Corbett don't handle that well." She brought him coffee around midnight, unable to sleep herself. They sat together on her small porch, listening to the night sounds of the valley. "What will you do?" Hosea asked. "After the harvest, I mean. After you sell your squash and secure your winter." Dorothea had been thinking about this question for weeks. "Plant again," she said simply. "Spring planting, traditional crops. But also," she hesitated, "I've been thinking about those seeds, about how they changed everything. What if there are other people like me, people who've lost harvests, who need a second chance?" "You're thinking about selling seeds?" "More than that. Teaching what you've taught me. Creating a seed exchange, maybe. The valley needs diversity, not just the same crops everyone else grows." She looked at him in the moonlight. "I'd need help. Someone who knows plants and seasons and indigenous growing methods. Are you asking me to stay?" His voice was soft, careful. "I'm asking if you want to." She turned to face him fully. You've given me more than seeds, Hosea. You've given me confidence, knowledge. You've shown me I'm not alone. I don't know what to call what's growing between us, but I know I don't want it to end when the squash comes in." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I came west to forget," he said quietly, "to run from memories. But maybe I stayed here to remember what it feels like to build something, to care about a harvest, to—" He paused, then continued with quiet intensity, "to feel my heart beat for someone again." "Stay," Dorothea whispered, "not as a hired hand or a temporary partner. Stay and build something with me, a life, a farm, whatever comes." His answer was a kiss, tender and fierce and full of promise. The attack came 2 nights before planned harvest. Dorothea woke to the smell of smoke and Hosea's urgent voice. "Fire! They've set fire to the shed!" They burst outside to find flames licking up the side of the old structure where Hosea had been staying. But worse, far worse figures were moving through the garden in the firelight, carrying clubs and axes, clearly intent on destroying the crop before it could be harvested. "No!" Dorothea screamed, running toward her garden. Hosea caught her arm. "Get water! Fight the fire! I'll handle them!" What happened next became valley legend. Hosea, armed only with his rifle and a decade of survival skills, descended on the saboteurs like an avenging spirit. His first warning shot sent one man diving for cover. His second, carefully placed to ricochet off a rock near another man's feet, sent the would-be destroyers scattering. But Dorothea barely noticed. She was fighting the fire with bucket after bucket of water from the creek, her arms screaming, her lungs burning from smoke. If the shed burned, it might spread to the house, to the garden. Everything could still be lost. Neighbors, drawn by the smoke and gunfire, came running. The Hendersons, who had always been kind. Old Mr. Wu from the Chinese camp down the valley. Even some of the smaller ranchers who had quietly admired Dorothea's persistence. They formed a bucket brigade, passing water from the creek until the fire was reduced to smoking timbers. By dawn, it was over. The shed was destroyed, but the house stood intact. More importantly, the garden was untouched. Hosea had driven off the attackers before they could do serious damage, and standing in the mud and ash, exhausted and furious, were 3 ranch hands still wearing Corbett Ranch brands on their shirts. The valley constable, summoned by the Hendersons, took statements and arrested the 3 men. Under questioning, they admitted Samuel Corbett had paid them to handle the Blackwell problem once and for all. By noon, the valley buzzed with news. By evening, Samuel Corbett was in custody, his reputation destroyed, his ranch's credit pulled by every merchant in the territory. Harvest Day came under a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. Dorothea walked through her garden with tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of joy. The squash had reached perfection. Each fruit was massive, heavy, with deep blue-green skin hard as armor. Hosea had rigged a cart, and together they began the harvest, carefully cutting each squash from its vine with the reverence it deserved. They counted as they worked. 50 squash, 75, 100. The numbers kept climbing. When they finally finished, the cart was piled high with 237 perfect Hubbard squash, each one a testament to resilience and hope. Word had spread through the valleys about the miraculous late-season crop, and buyers arrived before Dorothea could even transport the harvest to town. The Henderson family bought 50 squash for their boarding house and restaurant. Mr. Wu bought 30 for his camp and to ship to Chinese communities in California. Individual families bought them by the half dozen, storing them in root cellars for the long winter. When the last squash was sold, Dorothea counted her money with shaking hands. $43, nearly 3 times what she'd expected from her original planting. But the real surprise came the next day, when people started returning not to complain, but to ask about the seeds. "My crop failed early," one farmer admitted. "Blight got the whole field, but I've still got 6 weeks of good weather. Could I try those fast-growing seeds?" "The boarding house wants to know if we can grow them ourselves next year," Mrs. Henderson said. "Would you sell seeds?" Within a week, Dorothea and Hosea found themselves overwhelmed with requests. They carefully saved seeds from the best squash, packaging them with detailed planting instructions based on Hosea's Nez Perce knowledge and their own hard-won experience. The seed business grew faster than the squash had. Farmers throughout the valley wanted not just the Hubbard squash, but other quick-growing varieties. Hosea reached out to his trading contacts, bringing in seeds from indigenous communities. Across the territory, beans that fixed nitrogen, corn varieties adapted to different climates, root vegetables that stored well through harsh winters. By the following spring, Dorothea's small property had been transformed. The garden had expanded, but more importantly, a new structure stood where the burned shed had been a seed house, built with timber donated by grateful neighbors and designed to store and organize dozens of seed varieties. The transformation wasn't just physical. Dorothea herself had changed. The desperation and fear that had haunted her eyes had been replaced by confidence and purpose. She moved through the valley now as a respected businesswoman, someone whose opinion mattered, whose knowledge was sought. And the Corbett Ranch? Samuel Corbett, released from custody but ruined in reputation, had been forced to sell off most of his holdings to pay debts and legal fees. His son Silas had disappeared, some said to California. The remaining land and resources had been bought by a consortium of smaller farmers who were determined to work cooperatively rather than competitively. One morning, a thin, broken-looking Samuel Corbett appeared at Dorothea's door. Hosea stepped forward protectively, but Dorothea raised a hand to stop him. "Mr. Corbett," she said neutrally. "Miss Blackwell." He removed his hat, and she saw how much he'd aged. I wanted to—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "I destroyed your garden because I was afraid of competition, afraid of a woman succeeding where I might fail, afraid of change." He met her eyes. "I was wrong. What I did was criminal and cruel. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I know that." Dorothea was quiet for a long moment. The easy thing would be to turn him away, to let him carry his guilt alone. But she thought about Hosea, about second chances, about seeds planted in scorched earth. "The land remembers everything we give it," she said finally, "good and bad. But it also keeps growing, keeps producing, keeps trying." She paused. "I need someone to maintain the seed storage area. It's hard work, but it's important work. The pay isn't much." Samuel Corbett's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to do better. What you do with it is your choice." He took the job. Within months, he had become one of the most dedicated employees in the Valley's growing seed cooperative, teaching young farmers with a humility born from his own failures. The wedding took place in early summer, 18 months after that terrible morning when Dorothea had knelt in the ruins of her first garden. They held it outdoors, naturally, in a field of flowering squash vines that had become known throughout the territory as the Miracle Garden. Dorothea wore a simple blue dress, the color of Hubbard squash skin. Hosea wore his finest buckskins, though he'd trimmed his hair at Dorothea's gentle request. "I want to see your face clearly when I promise you forever," she'd said. The entire valley attended, farmers and traders, indigenous peoples and immigrants, former enemies and new friends. Even Chief Twisted Hair traveled down from Nez Perce country to witness the union, bringing gifts of rare seeds and his blessing on the couple who had brought his people's agricultural wisdom to the wider world. They exchanged vows under an arbor woven from bean vines, promising to tend each other as carefully as they tended their gardens, to weather storms together, to celebrate harvests side by side.